Hello, welcome back to part four. Um, so, climate change, the greenhouse effect itself was discovered by Fourier in 1827. And as I was saying, without it, without that trapping of the sun's heat as it reflected off the Earth, the planet would be about 30 degrees colder, and none of us would probably be here. But whereas the natural greenhouse effect is such a help and such a good thing, we've managed to make it much worse. We've done that because the Industrial Revolution created a fossil fuel economy. Drawing initially on coal and then on oil and gas, we have burnt huge amounts of fossil fuel, releasing carbon into the atmosphere and increasing that layer of greenhouse gases, increasing the amount of heat that is reflected back into the Earth. And that's exacerbated by the fact that greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and the others, have very long lifetimes. They sit in the atmosphere perhaps for years at a time. Around 32 times carbon dioxide for methane and many hundreds and thousands of times for CFCs. Very unfortunately, the very chemicals that had caused the ozone depletion problem also turned out to be the most powerful greenhouse gases affecting climate change. So as the science started to come forward and people began to understand the nature and size of the problem, the UK government in 1989 created something called the Global Atmosphere Division in the Department of Environment in London, in Whitehall, and I was, I think, the second or third person to join that group as one of the civil servants first working on the climate change issue. And at that stage, of course, most of our understanding of climate change came from scientific models created by atmospheric scientists and others. And there were just 4 supercomputers across the world, one in Hamburg, 2 in the United States, and one at the Met Office here in the UK, that were large enough to run the models responsible for our understanding of climate change. And of course, in the 30 years odd since, those computers have grown exponentially, and the models have grown ever more complicated. Some of the first key steps that the international community took in trying to tackle, or at least to understand, climate change. In 1988, the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization created the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And many of you will know that the IPCC remains the preeminent source of independent scientific advice on climate change across the world. And its reports are the absolute foundation of our understanding of climate change science. And the IPCC started work in 3 main areas: looking at the science, modelling climate change, looking at the possible impacts across different countries, across different areas, and looking at the responses. What could we do to try and tackle climate change, particularly if it meant adjusting the social policies that underlie so much of our economy and society dependent on fossil fuels. As it happened at that stage, the Prime Minister here in the UK was Margaret Thatcher, coming towards the end of her time as Prime Minister. But actually, and perhaps strangely, one of the world leaders who first grasped the importance of climate change and expressed a strong commitment to acting on it. That was partly perhaps because she was herself originally a chemist. The science was something she could understand. And she became very committed to the issues around climate change. She gave an important speech at the UN General Assembly where she talked about the fact that we did not own the planet. We had the planet on trust with a full repairing lease. And like parents looking after a house we wanted to pass on to our children, we should be looking after the planet for future generations and not leaving it severely damaged by impacts of climate change. In late 1990, she gave her last speech overseas at the Second World Climate Conference in Geneva, which also received the first IPCC report. And I was present for that speech with Chris Patten, who was the Secretary of State for Environment at the time. And it was a very important and impassioned speech, which urging all the world leaders to take climate change seriously and to start considering the actions that were needed to tackle it. Obviously, we'd been discussing it with our European Union colleagues, driven particularly by the Scandinavian countries, by the Dutch, who had a strong understanding and wish to see climate change tackled early and rigorously. And UK policy at that time that we were evolving had 2 or 3 main strands that are worth touching on. We were very conscious that the UK was producing about 3% of global emissions of carbon dioxide. The US, by contrast, was producing around 25%. And as we'll see in a moment when I put up some figures, other big countries, the Chinas, Indias, Brazils of the world, were also greatly increasing their emissions. So the UK government took the view that whatever was going to be done internationally on climate change, it had to be done cooperatively and it had to involve the US as not just the richest but by far the most influential country. We were very well aware, and we talked to the Chinese and the Indians at an early stage, that they were very unlikely to make any commitments on climate change or join in the international agreement if the US stood to one side. So that was the first thing. The second is that we also had to agree what the UK's own policy was going to be. And that was a discussion that took place obviously between departments. There was then a Department of Energy, the Department of Trade and Industry, our colleagues in what was then called ODA, the Aid Ministry, and that had to be developed over a year or so of a long series of meetings, discussions and papers to try and make sure that the UK took a strong, constructive line on climate change. We obviously were building on the example of the ozone agreement that we've talked about, but we were well aware that the scope of this was much greater and vaster. And I can remember sitting in a number of meetings with the Department of Transport officials at the time, because cars were such a large and growing source of emissions in the UK. And at that stage, it was inconceivable that we would be replacing the internal combustion engine with something different. The issue we were debating was whether it was possible to slightly increase petrol prices to decrease the use of cars and encourage people onto buses and other public transport. And internationally, there was a large number of issues we had to take into account in developing the approach that we were going to take in the negotiations. And a lot of those revolved around the G77, the developing countries. We talked about the concerns they have about the historic responsibility that developed countries, the industrialised West, had. After all, it was we who had put all the carbon emissions up into the atmosphere in the first place, as we industrialised and took all the benefits from that. Many of the G77 countries continue to have a much stronger concern and focus on poverty and development in their own countries for their own populations, and environmental issues were seen as something that could be left for another day. And building on the discussions and the successful conclusion of the London Amendments and Montreal Protocol, the G77 countries were clear right from the start that if there was going to be action on climate change, then the industrialised countries, the OECDs, had to take the same approach we had with CFCs, provide funding for them to make changes to their economy, and provide technology transfer to enable them to adopt newer, cleaner technologies. However, it's worth stressing as well that within the G77 there was by no means a homogeneous view. The views of Saudi and the other Gulf oil supply countries was entirely different from the group of small countries known as the Alliance of Small Island States, countries like the Maldives and others. And for those very small island states, primarily in the Pacific, climate change wasn't just an important issue, it was an existential issue. If sea level rise happened and by a few feet, then some of these countries would effectively be wiped out. So within the many countries, the 130 odd countries at that stage that formed the developing country group, we were very much aware that the views of China and India would be in one place, those of African countries in another, AOSIS, the small island states in another, and of course the oil producers and others. So we knew going in that the convention negotiations were going to be very much a 3D puzzle to try and make sure that everyone was able to come on board. And within those countries, of course, as I said, primarily the US was always going to be the key. The US was led by President Bush at the time, the Bush the Elder, a Texas oil man committed to fossil fuels from which his family had made their money and on which many of his strongest supporters had their base. The US was deeply attached, even more attached than the UK, to their cars and to very cheap petrol. Much of the US was still a coal-based economy. And John Sununu, the former governor of New Hampshire, who was chief of staff in the White House, was scarred by his experience as governor, where in trying to promote a nuclear power plant he'd been thwarted by environmental protesters at the time. And unfortunately this meant he approached most environmental issues with a view that those arguing for action were some kind of flakes, that they had it wrong, that the science was unreliable. And with all this, of course, were the lobbyists spending huge amounts of money to defend oil, defend coal, defend cars. And many of you will know that in the US, money and lobbying is such a big driver of political decision making, far more so than we might see in the UK. So all of these issues were going to be very important in trying to bring the US on board to any agreement on climate change that it might be possible to produce. And finally for this session, just a slide to look at global emissions. This actually takes us all the way back to the very, very earliest days of industrialization and projected forward to 2015 at that stage. And what I think the story that tells is that the United States was absolutely critical, but so too were countries like China, India, other parts of Asia and Pacific, whose emissions were relatively low at the time we're talking about in around 1990, but who we knew because of their own development and growth were going to be increasingly important in not just adding to global emissions, which were climbing very much so in this period, but that proportion that they contributed was going to become ever greater. So the UK's approach in the negotiations right from the start was to recognise that it was absolutely essential to bring the US on board as the biggest emitter in the world and the world's most important and influential country, but that also we had to bring the countries like China, India, Brazil, the other key leaders of the developing world on board, because without their commitment from the start, we would only be postponing the problem and not addressing it seriously. That's the end of this section. Look forward to you coming back.